With the end of the decade, welcome to this video on the subject of Canadian temperatures over the last 10 years. We hear all sorts of claims in the media and from politicians, but few hard and straight numbers. Let's have a look at what actually happened. In previous videos on Canada, I used locations that were chosen because they had data going back as far as possible. This severely limited the number of locations that could even be considered. If we are only looking at the last 10 years, we can include different stations in order to physically cover more of the country. Most of the previous locations remain as they correspond to key population centers and also provide some continuity with the previous data. Welland and Saskatoon are left out, while Iqaluit, Goose Bay, Churchill, and Holmen, which is near Iqaluit on Victoria Island, were added. The data used was the average temperature at each location for each month. This data and these locations are by no means the 100% complete picture, but it is certainly a good start, and if it shows a strong trend, that would be difficult to ignore. The numbers you see are the 10-year linear temperature trend in Celsius degree for the 16 locations for each month. The clearly upward trends are shaded in yellow. The clearly downward trends are shaded in blue. In order to more easily summarize the results, each is classified as either clearly up but not significantly up, unchanged, down but not significantly down, and clearly down. Unchanged is defined here as a linear trend of 0.3 of a degree Celsius or less over the course of the decade in either direction. Not significantly is defined here as a trend of more than 0.3 of a degree, but which mathematically explained less than 5% of the variance in the temperature. Clearly up and clearly down mean that the linear trend was more than 0.3 of a degree, and that trend explained 5% or more of the variance. This distinction between clearly and not significantly is a bit of an arbitrary line, but I felt it necessary to distinguish between clear linear trends and those that showed change but were mixed in with so much variability that the linear nature of that trend could easily be questioned. In such cases, adding one previous or subsequent observation could easily change the trend. However, such a linear trend has to be noted as even with the variability, if that same, perhaps insignificant pattern was to continue over a longer period of time, it would certainly become significant. Goose Bay in April is an example of a very clear downward trend with passage of time alone explaining almost 50% of the temperature variation. Statistically, that is a lot. You could remove any one of those individual data points and still have the same significant trend. Goose Bay in March, however, while showing a mathematical trend of minus 1.2 degrees over the decade, included a lot of variability, and the trend is not visually very clear, and if people chose to remember the two higher years, they might think the trend was different. With 16 locations and 12 months each, there are 192 trends to consider. Of these, 84 are clearly trending down, 29 are down but not significantly down, 23 are unchanged, 24 are up but not significantly up, and 32 are clearly up. When looking at the individual locations, 11 have more downward trends, while 4 have more upward trends. In terms of regions, from Winnipeg to the East Coast is dominated by downward trends. As we move west, we see an increase in upward trends. By the time we get to Dawson and Nanaimo, upward trends are clearly more common than downward trends. If we consider Iqaluit, Holmen, and Dawson as the far north, there are slightly more downward trends there. Of the 12 months, 10 have more downward trends than upward trends, and only May has more ups than downs. A couple of the trends are very strong. February and October are overwhelmingly down, especially February, with 5 locations falling by an average of 7 degrees or more. If you don't like this way of classifying the results, other approaches are possible. For example, we could ignore how convincingly linear a trend was and just look at the average change and group them into 7 different categories from strongly up to strongly down. If we do that, the basic pattern remains the same, both with the location and the monthly numbers. Feel free to pick another reasonable classification. It won't change the overall balance of the results. Many more months showed a downward trend than an upward trend, and if we consider the strong trends, the downward trends were even more dominant. What does this mean? It says nothing about what occurred in the preceding years, and by itself it is not a prediction of what will happen in the future. It is not even a 100% complete picture of what happened in Canada in the last 10 years, although it is a long step in that direction. What it does do is put into perspective what you see and hear in the media and from politicians almost daily. We are fed a constant narrative that every year is yet another warmest ever, and other similar categorical statements in almost every country. Certainly that is what we hear in Canada. As far as I'm concerned, the rhetoric, declarations, agendas, and ideologies are increasingly meaningless. Data and numbers must be the guide when discussing such a subject. If you make a claim and the numbers don't actually say that, why should anyone pay attention to that claim? And what does it tell you about the person or persons making the claim? As usual, this data is publicly available, and anyone who runs the numbers has to come up with the same results. Finally, the question remains as to what are the longer-term trends. That is a more complex question, but stay tuned for a future video.